So could the rise in gun violence and criminality that we're seeing in an industrialized country be actually a symptom of underlying poor metabolic health and blood sugar regulation, as well as exposure to common medications like amphetamines, SSRIs, and other psychiatric medications, as well as micronutrient deficiency? In today's show, we're going to explore a dossier of literature that suggests that exposure to these common medications, blood sugar irregularities, and chronic inflammation actually weakens empathy and leads to poor loss of emotional control, leading people to be more impulsive and participate in violent endeavors and aggressive behaviors that might harm other people. I think this is really important to talk about. We're hearing so much about gun control, and no one is talking about mental health. No one is talking about how blood sugar irregularities cause people to be more impulsive and more reactive and more aggressive. Also, the medications. There's a large dossier of literature to suggest that common psychiatric medications cause people to lose empathy. Why aren't we hearing about this? I think, the big focus of our channel, my friends, is focusing on the root cause. Obviously, it's a problem if someone gets 7 AR-15s in one day, especially if they have a psychiatric issue. But we also need to focus on why so many people are unhappy, have suicidal ideations, or are violent. It's not just gun violence. We're seeing people fighting in the streets more, yelling at each other. There are school fights. Suicides are through the roof, especially amongst our youth. So let's talk about the root cause and talk about how we can further help people, friends in our family and our communities, to think better and to not have these violent inclinations, because we know that, and studies have shown in inmates and so forth, when they supplement them with vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids, their violent behavior actually goes down. There's a correlation here, and we're going to dive into that literature. But first, let's start off with this interesting connection between exposure to common psychiatric medications known as SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. There's a large body of evidence to suggest that many of these mass shootings in schools can be traced back to exposure to common psychiatric medications. Now, I know this gets controversial because some of you have benefited from these medications, where you have friends and family that have benefited from them. So please listen to this with a grain of salt. Just understand that there is a connection between loss of empathy and changes in mental affect and mood when people go on these SSRIs. And it might cause people who have violent inclinations or suicidal behavior or ideologies to act on those thoughts and feelings and harm other people. So we should be aware of this. Now, you might be saying, well, it's no one's business if someone's on a medication. Well, I will challenge that statement, because it was supposedly everyone's business, whether or not you were vaccinated or not too long ago. Just to go to dinner, to get on an airplane and travel, you had to show proof of your health pass. So when someone commits a horrific crime and kills other people with weapons, lest I remind you, guns, they don't walk into schools by themselves. They require a human being to load them in a premeditated way, to walk and point the weapon at someone and actually pull the trigger and the action pin to fire off, a bullet and harm someone. So that behavior is directly correlated with the crime. And if these medications have been shown to alter behavior and lead to loss of empathy and loss of caring for other people, we should know about this. We should also be talking about this in the context of reducing violence and suicidal ideation that is so rampant in our society. So a British psychiatrist named David Healy has talked a lot about this. I'm not going to share with you every piece of his work, but he says some 90% of school shootings over more than a decade have been linked to a widely prescribed type of antidepressant called an SSRI. And I think it's important that you recognize this and check out his literature. He's written extensively on this, going back to Columbine and other mass shootings in Colorado and throughout the US, linking how these individuals who commit these horrific crimes have at some point in their life been exposed to these medications. And a new study finds why this may be. So this was a study here. This was just recently published in 2019 in Translational Psychiatry. The title of this paper is Antidepressant Treatment, Not Depression Itself, Leads to Reductions in Behavior and Neural Responses to Pain and Empathy. So this study had 29 patients that were being treated via a SSRI and healthy controls that were not. And what they found is after treatment with these medications, patients showed significant decreases in both affective empathy and activity of 3 priori selected brain regions associated with empathy for pain. This study suggests that antidepressants reduce the aversive responses triggered by exposure to the suffering of others. Now, it's not just this paper. There's other old studies as well, including this news story that I came across when Googling more about Columbine and the Aurora shooting and so forth. I used to live in Colorado, so those shootings were obviously near and dear to my heart. The title of this paper is just a news story. Centennial man with a history of psych drugs allegedly poisoned his mother. Imagine how much suffering an individual must be going through to poison their own mother. This is not normal behavior, my friends. This is completely abnormal. And we should be asking deeper questions when these horrific crimes are imparted upon other people. We need to get to the bottom of this. And if there is an association with SSRI use or amphetamine use, which there is, and violent criminality, then we should be warning people before they get on these medications. And that should be the last resort. Hey, Sally, I know you're depressed. I know you're anxious. Let's do everything from fasting, real food, exercise, sleep. Micronutrient supplementation, omega-3 index optimization, do everything. And if all that doesn't work, then we can possibly consider psychiatric drugs. But unfortunately, that's, of course, not the course of action that our medical system imparts upon people who are depressed. The first thing, my brother was feeling depressed recently, and after going through a separation and some issues in his personal life and so forth. And he filled out an online questionnaire. I'm not going to name you've probably seen Instagram ads for this particular business. And literally he filled out a questionnaire, had a 10-minute consult with someone, and they recommended 3 different psychiatric medications. They didn't look at his blood work. They didn't ask him any deeper questions about what's going on in his life. Why might he be feeling depressed? What is he eating? When you take your dog to the vet, that's the first question they ask. Hey, your dog's overweight? Oh, your dog has a urinary tract infection? Your dog is whatever. What are you feeding your dog, Sally? But we don't ask these questions for people who are feeling depressed. Why aren't we doing that? And I think this is a bigger problem, and that's why we're making this video. Now, another more recent article, and this was published in 2010 by a Peter Bregan, a medical doctor. I believe he's in the UK as well. This article is titled Antidepressant-Induced Suicide, Violence and Mania, Risk for Military Personnel. So this was a thorough literature review talking about how newer antidepressants frequently cause suicide, violence, and manic-like symptoms or activation or overstimulation, presenting serious hazards to active duty soldiers who carry weapons under stressful conditions. So look, I think if someone is buying a weapon and they're on an SSRI or they have a history of this, we should probably know about it. And I know that irks some of you who are very 2A, and I'm 2A myself, but look, if people are taking drugs that are causing them to lose empathy and disassociate and depersonalize, do you really want them carrying a weapon around? I don't know logistically how this would work, but I think we need to seriously consider this. And that this same author, Peter Bregan, has written another article titled Suicidality, Violence, and Mania Caused by SSRIs, a Review and Analysis. So I'm just putting this here. I'll link it in the show notes so that you have access to this should you want to dive into this rabbit hole. But I was blown away that no one is seemingly talking about this. So before we continue on, friends, I just want to thank you all for being here. Thanks for hitting that like button. Thanks for sharing this as a direct text message with someone you care about, so they're aware of the connections between blood sugar health, which we're going to talk about very soon, mental health, and exposure to these medications and how they might alter violent behavior and reduce empathy. I think it's really important. It's top of mind for a lot of people. So thanks for sharing this information. Speaking of mental health, you know that sleep is so important for mental health. Actually, we're going to talk about a study very soon in adolescents showing that when adolescents are on screen and using screens at night, they reduce their sleep quality, circadian rhythm dysfunction, and that is linked with depression, anxiety, and suicide-like thinking in adolescence. So sleep is so important for mental health. That's why we created the MyoRelax and Calm over at Myoscience. It has L-glycine, it has potassium glycinate, magnesium glycinate, myo-inositol, L-theanine, GABA, taurine. It's an awesome formulation that can help you get into a more calm, relaxed state. It's not a sedative. It's not Ambien. It's something that can help calm you down, and it's an alcohol-free way to unwind at night. So you can read some of the many reviews. There's 150 some odd reviews over at myoscience.com. This is a stevia-sweetened powdered drink mix that can support a calm feeling so that you can get into a relaxation type state before bed. Check it out over at myoscience.com. That URL again is myoscience with an X, MYOXCIENCE.com. And please use the code podcast to save. Okay, so we've talked a lot about SSRIs up to now. We've talked about how they reduce empathy, how they're linked with suicidal behavior, and so forth. But let's talk more about blood sugar, and micronutrients. This has actually been studied for a very long time. The link between violent inmates and their association with omega-3 deficiency. And there's actually several clinical studies that have found that when inmates are put on omega-3 supplements and also vitamin mineral supplements, their violent behavior actually declines while they're in prison. In fact, when inmates in Australia were studied and their crimes were investigated as to why they were imprisoned in the first place, there was a strong association with more violent crimes and a reduction in their omega-3 index, which is their omega-3 status. So again, you might say, well, why do so many people have a deficiency in omega-3s? Well, if you live in a food desert, you live in the south side of Chicago or parts of Philadelphia or parts of New York or Brooklyn, stuff like that, where there's just fast food restaurants on every corner and convenience stores, and you don't have access to wild-caught fish or healthy whole foods, well, the foods that you're eating are rich in omega-6 processed, highly oxidizable seed oils. And our cell membranes are a big part of what makes up our brain. And the literature suggests that an inflamed brain is a more impulsive brain, is a less empathetic brain. And so if we can calm down some of that neural inflammation and the microglial activation by helping to improve omega-3 fatty acid status, that is linked with a reduction in violent behavior and aggressive behavior. So there's been several studies that have looked at this. One study titled Omega-3 Supplementation in Young Offenders, a randomized, stratified, double-blind, placebo-controlled parallel group study. This was actually published in the Journal of Experimental Criminology. Again, why aren't people talking about this with all the concern about gun violence and the rise in criminal-like behavior? I don't hear anyone talking about this. So this is really important that we mention this. This was a study back in early 2000s. The effect of dietary supplementation on aggressive behavior in Australia, adult male prisoners, a feasibility and pilot study for a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And in this particular study, they had individuals take a gram of omega-3s per day and found that it actually reduced the violent behavior. And other studies have looked at just basic vitamin supplementation, looking at folate and B12 and all these vitamins that are involved in neurotransmitter synthesis and maintenance of brain health, and found similar changes or reductions in violent behavior. So again, if we're going to be serious about gun control, why aren't we serious about micronutrient status? These are really low-cost items and easy to implement, I might add. Trying to take away 400 million guns from Americans is going to be a challenge. I mean, I don't even know if that's realistic, y'all. So I think we should start to focus on the mental health side and talk about how the increase in violence and suicidal behavior that we're seeing, especially amongst our youth, is probably more a reflection or a symptom of our poor metabolic health and micronutrient status. So just want you to know that tons of data out there, and it seems like no one is talking about this, but what we do know is there's an intimate connection between healthy glucose metabolism and empathy and lack of violent or criminality-like behavior. The inverse is true. People that have poor glucose control are much more likely to be involved in violent crimes. There's a great article that I would implore you to read titled Violent Crime and Healthy Glucose Metabolism. It is believed that hypoglycemia is associated with aggressive behavior. In addition, several imaging studies have shown that decreases in glucose uptake in the prefrontal cortex in violent offenders is quite common. And that's because the brain contains glycogen, an energy source or reserve, and so forth. And this is involved in feelings of empathy and turning on that prefrontal cortex. So when you have an active and healthy prefrontal cortex, we know that you're less likely to engage in impulsive behaviors that might harm other people. We know that in football players, for example, this is just one example. If you ever heard the story of, unfortunately, Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez had CTE. He participated in a series of really poorly thought out crimes that led to the death of, unfortunately, I believe it was his fiance's sister's boyfriend, something to that effect. And that really was just you could watch the documentary on this, but his behavior was not consistent with his intelligence. And upon autopsy, his brain had extensive signs of CTE. And so unfortunately, we do see this change in the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in rational thought, decision-making, logical order, and so forth. And when people have brain damage from trauma, there's a change, unfortunately, in that region of the brain that leads to people acting upon these impulsive-like behaviors and not thinking quite clearly. But it turns out that if you have poor blood sugar control, your prefrontal cortex is similarly challenged. And here we have the evidence here. So I just want to share this with you because it's really important here. The scientists in that article that I was just referencing say, in addition to poor glucose control or tolerance, low levels of glucose have been linked with signs of poor emotional regulation. They might say, well, low glucose is found when you're fasting. So if I fast or if I exercise, I'm going to go like harm someone. No, the situation here is probably reactive hypoglycemia from insulin resistance. So we know that if you eat a lot of processed food, right, your blood sugar will go up, your insulin will release, and that's going to decrease your blood sugar below your normal baseline level. And that might trigger your adrenal glands to release adrenaline and noradrenaline and cause more impulsive, violent behavior. So several studies have found that when glucose is low, people are more likely to report feelings of anxiety, irritability, tension, and other bad moods as compared to when glucose is more normal. One of the most important functions of self-control is being able to conform to the rules of society, including laws and moral restrictions that condemn violence, destructive, and exploitative actions. Conversely, low self-control is a leading cause of criminal and aggressive behavior. Criminal acts provide immediate gratification, whereas the long-term costs generally outweigh the long-term benefits, right? You can go rob someone for $100, but if you get caught, especially if you use a weapon during that robbing, you're going to spend a lot of time in jail. It would be easier to make $100 in other ways, but criminals don't think like that. It's immediate gratification. Loss of empathy. It's, I need the money now. I need to go harm people now. Well, why don't they think about these things? Probably because of the underlying poor metabolic health or medications that they're using or potentially damage to their brains, leading them to make very poor decisions that harm other people. And so that's why we're focusing in on this, which I think is really important to talk about. Okay, so let's look at glucose tolerance tests between people who haven't committed crimes compared to people who have. Glucose tolerance tests have confirmed that adolescent criminals and delinquents have poor glucose tolerance compared to non-criminals. Adjudicated adolescents tolerate glucose less effectively than non-adjudicated adolescents. Okay, and adolescent delinquents compared to non-delinquents also have poor glucose control, causing this unlawful, impulsive, violent-like behavior. And I don't need to tell you where the health foods stores and so forth in areas of the country that are riddled with crime. If we were serious about helping these people, why aren't we investing in gardens? Why aren't we investing in putting a Whole Foods in the south side of Chicago or parts of Philadelphia or parts of Detroit where crime is quite high, parts of Los Angeles, even downtown Seattle, crime is quite high. These people are eating junk food, right? So if we're serious about reducing crime, we should also focus on the nutrition because there's really good evidence to support this. Now, let's talk about methamphetamines. You know, unfortunately, a lot of people are on amphetamines, Ritalin, Adderall, not good. So methamphetamine users have higher self-ratings of depression and show lower regional glucose metabolism in the various parts of the brain that are involved in controlling impulses and actions and behavior. So depressive symptoms are quite common in these users, and it correlates with glucose metabolism. And parts of the brain that are augmented are the amygdala, the posterior cingulate nucleus, as well as the ventral striatum and cerebellum. And so we know that, unfortunately, people that are using meth, obviously the illegal substance, as well as legal Ritalin and Adderall have changes within their limbic system and parts of their brain, which is no good. So we need to start implementing micronutrition, omega-3 status, various B vitamins, and last but not least, sleep. And this was a study that recently looked at an analysis between circadian rhythm dysfunction, limbic system overactivation. So your limbic system is your emotional regulatory system in the brain. People that have been abused and have had early life trauma, so-called ACEs, adverse childhood events and so forth, have their amygdala and hippocampus is all sort of messed up and triggering them to be hyper reactive to certain situations. Well, it turns out that circadian rhythm disruption, especially in adolescence, triggers this emotional dysregulation that might cause more impulsive control, impulsive acting on impulsive thoughts and so forth, mood disorders, leading people to engage in substance abuse and risk-taking behaviors. Okay, so how many people that are trying to say that we need to take away 400 million guns talking about, well, let's focus on sleep a little bit first, right? Let's do these other things as well. I'm not saying guns aren't part of the problem and easy access to guns couldn't be part of the problem, and that should be tightened up maybe a little bit, but we should also focus on these other issues if we're serious about reducing violent crime. It's not just the school shootings, it's the suicidal behavior and people acting on suicides. There was an increase, I think, in suicides, 113% throughout the course of the pandemic amongst adolescents and youth. And that is just unfathomable. Why aren't parents focusing on this? If they want their kid to be around, to live for another day and not act upon these sort of irrational, impulsive ideas and fleeting emotions that people have. So a lot of really good evidence here, my friends. I think we'll do a deeper dive on these different topics one by one, but I wanted to give you a primer because this is top of mind for a lot of people. Obviously, we're all concerned about violent crime and criminals and so forth. That's why many of you, many people have left the cities because of this, because of the risk that living in a city, living in parts of LA, living in New York, living in Seattle, living in Portland, crime is through the roof. And that's why people are fleeing to the suburbs because they feel safer. And we should be focusing on the root cause as to why mental health is crumbling. It's really a symptom of our poor nutrition, of our poor lifestyles, of exposure to screens at night, and lack of social cohesion and social isolation is just driving people into the depths of depression and anxiety and causing people to act in taking risky behaviors. And I think it's time that we address the elephant in the room and look at sustainable solutions that can impact not only the mental health, but the physical health. When you have better blood sugar control, better sleep, better circadian rhythm dysfunction, when you replenish your body's deficient micronutrients and omega-3s, then you just feel better and you reduce your risk of all sorts of different diseases. So thanks as always for tuning in. I appreciate you sharing this video. Thanks for hitting that like button, and let me know what you think in the comments. We'll catch you next time. Take care now.